Even when it comes to issues of driver safety, F1 teams can get caught up in competitive paranoia. But an idea that they previously rejected is being pushed through as part of a plan to help protect drivers in extreme conditions. You might remember that several drivers suffered badly in the horribly hot Qatar Grand Prix, with Esteban Ocon vomiting in his helmet, Alex Albon getting checked for acute heat exposure, and Logan Sargeant retiring from the race because intense dehydration left him feeling sick. Lance Stroll even claimed he was passing out and fading in and out of consciousness through many of the track's high-speed corners. The consensus was that F1 had been lucky to escape a driver suffering serious consequences either through illness or an accident. Even in the evening, air temperatures were still over 30 degrees, humidity was high, and drivers estimated that cockpit temperatures were up to 80 degrees Celsius. A limit had been reached and the FIA decided to act, but we've been light on details until now. We should point out to start that this will all be naturally complemented by the fact that Qatar Grand Prix is moving over a month later in the calendar for 2024, which is wise because you wouldn't run the British Grand Prix in winter months, so it shouldn't be the case in reverse, running when there's excessive heat in one of the host country's hottest months. But it's good that the FIA is taking no chances, and the headline item for what's coming is what the rulemakers have described as a driver cooling scoop. That's kind of hard to imagine as, to us anyway, it conjures an image of something on top of the car feeding air into the cockpit. Not something ridiculously snorkel-like, but maybe something closer to what IndyCar uses, with a small device at the top of the car's aeroscreen. But F1's idea isn't going to be on top of the car at all. It'll effectively be a slotted device that fits under the chassis, that presumably feeds air up to the driver from the bottom of the cockpit. This will hopefully improve ventilation, although it's not exactly going to be cool, fresh air piped to the driver, so don't get any ideas about F1 cars becoming air-conditioned luxuries anytime soon. The cooling scoop has been discussed before, so this has presumably been on F1's radar for some time, it's just that teams have previously blocked it. The idea had been rejected because, according to the FIA, some people were worried it would interfere with the airflow being fed into the underfloor, which is the crucial part of ground effect F1 cars. Inevitably, this was linked to concerns that it could cause disadvantages given the disruption to the aerodynamics, and be something that some clever teams ended up exploiting in some way. As the FIA's F1 technical head Nicholas Tombassis put it, people were making up various slightly paranoid hypotheses about what can be used. It's classic F1, although not entirely without justification. We hear so much about the aero sensitivities of these cars, you have to imagine a scoop that draws some airflow into the car rather than being directed around the chassis to exactly where the designers want it to go must interfere with the aerodynamics to a degree. And there are bound to be ways to turn that to a team's benefit as well. Just look at how S-ducts previously became such a prominent feature. In that case, the air was being channeled from around the tip of the nose and directed out at the top of the car, but it's evidence of teams feeding air through the car for aerodynamic gain. But as far as the FIA is concerned, this risk is a minor factor. The planned incorporation of the design into the rules is just going to allow the cooling scoop to exist in a specific area with maximum defined dimensions. And to quote Tombassis again, it seems everyone's learned their lesson and thinks a bit less selfishly. To be honest, we'd be stunned if some teams don't at least try to find a way to manipulate the provision for a slotted part of the chassis for some kind of technical gain. That doesn't mean they'll be successful, but they are definitely going to try, and the same might also go for a second part of the plan to help drivers in extreme heat. This will kick in when a certain threshold is met for both temperature and humidity, and may only be applied to certain tracks with high G-force loading, because it's broadly accepted that a super hot race in Qatar on a high-speed track isn't the same as, say, a race like Hungary, that is very challenging but is at least a slow-speed circuit. So the plan is that when this threshold is met, the FIA will declare the race is in extreme conditions, like when they declare a wet race, for example. That will then trigger an increased weight allowance only by around 2 kilos, which will be mandatory for teams to meet. The FIA has things like big cooling vests in mind, such as the type that are a bit hit and miss in IndyCar at the moment, but are improving all the time. It will be interesting to see exactly how this is policed, because the FIA says it will also be mandatory to use for the purpose of cooling the driver, but it seems that isn't going to be tightly regulated. The FIA has wondered whether specifying exactly what would have to be fitted is the way to go, but also feels that if we start trying to standardise a system to a tender and all of that, it would be quite a slow process. The rationale is that if the teams are given 2 kilos and told to use it for this purpose, it will be in their own interest to do so, because that will keep the drivers cool, focused and not lose any performance. Tombazis said hopefully that will be the solution. We'd be lying if we said we were confident teams definitely won't try to play this with a bit of opportunistic ballast placement. If the teams do end up with some freedom with those 2 extra kilos, it feels a little bit like a cop-out, to be honest, as it leaves too much responsibility with the competitor. Tombazis has said we want to make it clear that it's not something that you can use for any form of dodgy advantage. Unless you're being naive and trusting the teams though, surely the only way to do that is to get more prescriptive. But Tombazis has specifically suggested that putting ballast in the cockpit, for example, could be an option if teams really wanted to. He's just claimed you'd be a bit of an idiot to do that. His rationale is that Qatar proved drivers were prone to making mistakes late in the race as the heat took its toll, so it's clearly not in the team's interest to risk that happening. We don't want to suggest that teams will deliberately make their drivers suffer, but we can definitely imagine a scenario where teams and drivers do effectively agree that it's worth taking a chance if they spot a legitimate potential performance gain. Let's see what makes it into the regulations and if it ends up being a bit more tightly defined than Tombazis has implied, because this is the same issue as leaving it with the drivers to continue or retire, which is what the FIA didn't want to rely on and sparked all these ideas in the first place. Situations like this will inevitably result in some cries of, but why don't the drivers just park it if they can't handle the heat, which ignores a very simple F1 truth. While running in last place in Qatar, far adrift from the points, made Logan Sargeant's decision to retire easier, having already been weakened by flu-like symptoms earlier in the week, that decision's a lot more difficult for drivers who are fighting for a tangible reward. Ocon, who literally threw up, declared retiring was not an option and said, "You need to kill me to retire." That shows why the FIA had to do something. There's so much at stake for the drivers and the teams in any F1 race. Leaving the power in their hands over whether they continue in extreme conditions is never going to be a good idea. The same goes for how you regulate a weight allowance that's meant to be to protect the drivers, not offer a loophole for teams to exploit. It's not just extreme heat that the FIA is trying to implement some solutions for, but hopefully this one progresses a bit better than another ongoing project. A while ago now, F1 started researching and developing spray guards, officially called the Wet Weather Package, or WWP for acronym fans, in response to the desire to avoid a repeat of the farcical 2021 Belgian Grand Prix. The idea is that the WWP is a bolt-on package that can be fitted for extreme wet conditions and allow the cars to be raced by containing enough of the spray to ensure that the visibility is good enough to race in. Unfortunately, the first test in July, which ran on a Mercedes at Silverstone, proved to be a failure. The guards covered only small parts of the wheels, and as Tombazis put it, it didn't make a tangible difference to the visibility. Given the objective is to reduce the spray by 50%, that was a big disappointment. So it's back to the drawing board. A complete cover of the wheels has been developed, and the next step is to see how much that can reduce the spray. In July, Tombazis said he hoped the new version could be tested sometime in autumn 2023, but logistical problems put paid to that, with parts availability and production capacity for teams working with the FIA a problem. It was too expensive to conduct the test on that timeline. The plan now is to run them in the spring of 2024. But even if that test goes well, 2025 is the earliest the WWP could be raced, and if the test doesn't go well, then it's going to be 2026 or beyond. One of the problems is understanding how much of the spray is flung into the air by the tyres and how much is picked up from the ground by the undercar aero and then flung out of the diffuser. The test earlier this year didn't give a definitive answer, and unfortunately it's not viable to cover the diffuser because that would not just compromise the aerodynamic performance of the car, it would torpedo it. The aim is laudable, to have something that won't cost too much downforce and improves visibility sufficiently to make it safe to race in the worst of the rainy conditions. It's an optimistic objective, it just might not be possible. And now it won't be until several months into 2024 that we know whether this idea can even start to move from pipe dream to reality.